So Woody, could you talk about any familiarity you have with zapping that went on at the encampment?
Well, that's a big topic because I was involved a lot with the zapping stuff that was going on at the peace camp, and involved with a group of women that were trying to address those issues in very serious ways. And it was the zapping almost seemed like at times a different topic from the peace work that the camp was involved in. And it kind of ran counter to it often, and so there were a lot of difficulties with working with the zapping, and yet we needed to work with the zapping because we believed that it was very detrimental to our health and deteriorating the peace camp, and that it was a military issue that was not being addressed for the most part.
Could we just back up and give a little bit of information about when we refer to zapping, what are we talking about?
Zapping is a term that we use when we were referring to electromagnetic radiation specifically being directed at the peace camp. Okay, and it could have been directed at a particular individual, not at the peace camp, but zapping was that action of electromagnetic radiation being directed, and mostly in the form of microwave radiation, but it took also the forms of other frequencies, low frequency waves and different wavelengths, which had different effects on brain, body, stuff like that. Knowing this was happening was the difficult part, because it's very hard to measure that, and it's very hard to measure if it's general electromagnetic radiation in the air or if it's directed. And at that time it was in the mid-'80s, and a lot of this equipment wasn't available, or if it was available, it was very expensive to measure. The other premise that we were working on was that the base was actually zapping us, not like just general electromagnetic radiation, that the base was directing it at the peace camp, and so they had the power to turn it on and off. So if we were measuring it and they knew we were measuring it, they could just turn it off so we wouldn't have a measurement, and then we couldn't prove anything. And we also knew that we were being tapped and listened to most of the time, but we didn't have like things that we could point to and say the bug is over there or over here, because there's very sophisticated ways of listening in, which sometimes just depend on listening to the vibration of the windows in a room with windows and people talking. It's the more we delved into the subject of surveillance, zapping, electromagnetic radiation, the more we understood how difficult it was to monitor these things, to measure these things, and that we couldn't get a good grip on it. So the group that I worked with, we were determined to figure this out. And so we had to kind of come up with different ideas. Now, over in England, Greenham Common had been, there had been measurements taken at different campfire areas at Greenham Common, and from a scientist who had the equipment. And that's how we found out that zapping was actually happening. When women from Greenham Common came over to the peace camp at Seneca, they told us some of the things that were happening as a result of zapping. Health effects, different just mental stuff going on, like the delusional stuff or migraine headaches and stuff that happens a lot in your head. And that was, they felt after having measurements taken, et cetera, and having the situation looked at from a person who knew and understood those things, that they were being zapped. And it was directed at them. The zapping was happening at some campfires and not at other campfires, things like that. And so when we listened to that information, we started understanding that perhaps this was happening at the peace camp too, because we were starting to experience other things like that too. so a group of us decided to work with that issue. Lots of women didn't believe we were being zapped, and a lot of people had different opinions about it and didn't think it was really important to work on it, just like we're being bugged too, but why sit there and try to figure out where the bugs are? We'll just work in our ways. But it was a health issue, and also it became a issue that the military was developing electromagnetic radiation as weaponry to do crowd control stuff and to do warfare, basically, without killing people, just hurting them. And so it became a project for a lot of us to work with that as part of the peace work of the camp, though other women didn't see it that way.
How did you decide who would be a part of the group and who wouldn't?
That was a very involved thing that happened at the beginning. There were women who wanted to be involved and women who didn't want to be involved, and all this stuff. And so we would have these meetings, but we couldn't have them at the camp because the camp was being bugged. So we'd have to have them off the camp grounds, which sometimes was in Geneva and sometimes was at the restaurant, Nicastros, right. And so we would have these meetings at different places, but we never had the sense that we still had the sense that we were being watched or listened to and stuff like that. And so the issue became, how do we have these meetings where we talk about doing this work and measuring things, because we don't really want the government to know if we're going to measure something or what our strategies were, because it was trying to catch them in the act, but we couldn't catch them in the act if they knew what our plan was. So a lot of it at the beginning was trying to figure out just that logistical stuff.
Woody, I do remember that there was quite a large number of people being in Ithaca at a particular home, and that if you sat in a particular chair by the window, things were happening to whoever sat in that chair. And there were a number of skeptics who didn't believe it. Mm-hmm. And I remember that we started swapping. There had been a black van that people had seen outside. Do you remember that?
I remember that vaguely, but more what comes to my mind when you talk about that was at the peace camp. I'll tell you something that happened with me that, if I had any doubts before that, I didn't have any doubts after that. And that was that easy chair in the pit that was right by the steps to go into the living room. Uh-huh. It was the most comfortable chair in the pit, and so it was kind of like if you got it for the evening, it was good. And anyway, I was sitting in that chair. It was a kind of a cold day, so everybody was in the pit, and we were all hanging out talking. There was probably 8 or 9 of us in there, and so I was sitting in that chair, and all of a sudden I felt this zing in my ear. It was like a painful stab in my ear, and it was a sound that went like bing, and then it just died out, and it hurt. And I was just sitting there, and all of a sudden I jumped up and I went, ow, and everyone was like, what? And I said, I don't know, just something hurt my ear or something. I took my hand away, and there was a red mark. Women were looking, and they said, there's a red mark on your right here, and it's starting to spread in a circle around my thing. And then it disappeared after about 5 minutes. And to me, that was a direct hit, or something like that. But I've never experienced anything quite like that before or since. And then I noticed that other times women sat in that chair, they would start feeling sick to their stomach, or they would have a headache or something like that. And I think that there was like you described, there was a chair that, it was the most comfortable chair, but it was also the electric chair or something like that. It was kind of enter at your own risk. And so I don't know, I do remember some of what you're talking about. The black van, maybe. There are times throughout these years that we're working on the zapping issue that there were very suspicious looking things happening all the time. And again, it was like, is this our imagination? Is this a paranoia thing, or is this real? And again, we would try not to buy into fears a lot, but at the same time, I know that at my house in Cleveland, there are men sitting outside my house with, earphones on and stuff like that for most of the afternoon. And somebody called me and told me, so I went outside and asked them what they were doing there, and they acted like I wasn't even standing there asking them anything. Kind of weird. Just strange things happened a lot at my house. Strange things happened a lot at the women's houses that were involved in this group. It's hard because, again, these were things, zapping was something that was detrimental to health. So we didn't want to expose ourselves to that kind of a thing all the time. And at the same time, it was a project that we had to be involved in, we felt, in certain ways, but we couldn't talk about it to other people, and we did sound like maniacs. And so we had certain things that we could do, but very few things to protect ourselves. Your question earlier about how people got chosen and stuff like that, it wasn't like they got chosen. We were trying to have these open meetings with everyone who wanted to be involved with it in the thing, but again, we were feeling like this wasn't the right way to do it because we couldn't get to that stuff. We could have some open meetings, and then some women were just kind of, not really involved with it, but just kept throwing up issues that were periphery to what we were trying to do. And so we did start meeting more as a tighter group, people who were just very interested in it, in Ithaca. And then we were say, okay, we're not gonna, one person would set up where the meeting was gonna be, but we wouldn't know where the meeting was gonna be until we got to Ithaca. And so then then when we got to Ithaca, we wouldn't even talk about where the meeting was gonna be. The person would just take us to the meeting place. And often it was kind of a going around town or going up and down in buildings and out of buildings, just to kind of, if there was somebody following us, to throw them off, I mean, it was a little bit of a, some of the women that were not really involved with the group later on and involved with that, saying this is just so ridiculous and stuff like that. And yet it was like, well, you don't have to be involved with this if you feel it's ridiculous. But there were some of us that were definitely feeling like, let's just take all these precautions. Why not? It's not going to hurt us. And
how did you know what precautions to take? Where did you learn sort of losing surveillance things?
Because as we learned about surveillance techniques, we tried to learn how to block those surveillance techniques. Often where we would end up doing our meetings was at Cornell University in some building that had a women's room that had cinder block walls and no windows, and that had a lounge area, or a place where we could kind of be away from the toilets, and we would all bring food and just sit there for the day and have our meeting in that day. But we would change that women's bathroom area every time. We didn't go to the same one. And so again, it was like, well, if somebody's following us, they can't go into the women's room if they're a man. They can't listen in on the windows if they're trying to listen through windows, because that couldn't go through cinder block. The only way that they would be able to, well, not the only way, because we don't know all the ways, but they would have to put a bug on us, and we could all kind of be careful about what clothes we wore and stuff like that. We could, let's see, there are just certain things that after a while we just got savvy at, and we just said, well, at least they can't do it this way. They have to figure out a more sophisticated way, and they might still be listening in. And, if we had some, okay, it gets into a real complicated thing. Just like going to a meeting became a very complicated thing. Everything was very complicated, and that's why zapping is such a big issue, because the women at the camp that wanted to hear about what was going on, we couldn't talk about what was going on because we couldn't explain it. And then it became an exclusivity issue. We tried to get women who wanted to be involved in the meetings to be involved in the meetings. I think, Estelle, you came to a few and then you just said, I'm opting out here, which was fine with us. It was either way, but either you're in or you're out kind of thing. It became like a screening thing almost for people to come in and out because as the group got more sophisticated in its ways of getting information from the outside world and the scientific world, etc., we had to keep those places and names secret and how we were getting to those people, because those people that were giving us information were very clear that they did not want to be their name associated with the peace camp. They would give us information, they were sympathetic to our cause, and they believed what we were doing. But they did not want their name mentioned. They did not want us to contact them at home. They did not want their job. They would meet us on a corner in a phone booth, in a strange city at a certain time and one time only. And all of these things were very important to keep the confidentiality of these people if we were going to get their help. And we did have to approach a lot of people who were in that scientific realm or working with the government on the weaponry, who were working on that in those projects as their life work. They had trained for this and they wanted to keep their jobs, but they also verified when we explained, we think we're being zapped at the camp, and we'd explain our situation and they'd say, everything you say sounds just like some of the things that we listen to in our conferences when we go to our scientific conferences, and they bring up this evidence, they point to this experiments, and your group would qualify for that. In the country, isolated from everybody, a group of women, so that those statistics are all women, all certain ages of women. Women that are not necessarily having the support of all the surrounding areas so that they're isolated. All the things that you say are in place. They're a perfect place for having an experiment. And so, and also that they're anti-government women, it's like this is a good group to work with. So we would get verified that way a lot, that, yeah, you're probably, all your suspicions are probably true. And I'll give you some information, just don't contact me, don't, do this. So we had these variables always to work with, and we were more and more convinced that we were on the right track. And that one thing you said about education, we felt that our only defense was to tell other people the secrets of the government. And so we had to, so what we ended up doing was saying, it'd be great if, 2020 would do something or some show like that on TV to make it so believable. But we didn't have those resources, so we went and did workshops around the country in different places. And so we were involved in lots of different ways, finding the information, consolidating the information, trying to seek help in spreading that information, spreading the information ourselves, and yet protecting the peace camp, which was very difficult because a lot of times the women were very upset with the zapping group because they were exclusive group that wouldn't let other people come into their meetings, and they weren't contributing to the peace camp. They just come to the peace camp, all go to Ithaca, come back, and then leave. And the peace camp was their sleep space or dumping ground. They weren't really contributing. And anyway, so it got very and then we had to set up policies for the peace camp. One thing that we learned was that the radiation affected mostly watery parts of the body, the brain, the heart, and the uterus. And so we had to say women who are pregnant or had some issues like in those areas should not come to the peace camp, which was very upsetting to the women who hit the peace camp who didn't have very many women. And they said, why are we telling women not to come to the peace camp when we need every woman who wants to come? And so it just got very confusing and difficult. It was a very difficult thing to work with. When we got back from our meetings, we couldn't talk about the whole meeting or zapping. We just had to talk about nothing that was going to be controversial or pointing to the fact that we had just had a meeting, because then we'd all be monitored more and all that stuff. It was just very difficult and went on for years. This is a very emotional part for me. And I don't mind talking about it. It's just that it takes a lot of effort, and I want it to be in, part of the history, because this was the issue a lot of times for a lot of us, the health issues and trying to keep people safe but not being able to. But the health issues with the zapping was a serious thing, and one of them was recording the health effects. So that was one of our ways of trying to figure out if this was really happening. Were women experiencing health effects? Okay, so what we were trying to do is record if this was really happening, and that's why we were trying to get the information from other women. What experiences did they have with the health effects at the peace camp? What did they experience? And some women wrote back, but there wasn't a lot. But we tried to keep a journal there at the peace camp, and then we explained to women, if you're here at the peace camp visiting and whatever, and you feel sick or migraine, headache, or some weird things happening to you, record it in this book, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get some information. And I don't know, I don't have that book anymore, but I passed it on, but I may have Xeroxed off some of that information, and if I do, I can send it to you. And may you not be persecuted throughout your life because you have that piece of information or something. But anyway, that really wasn't filled out extensively either, but it gave us some things, because not everybody woman record things. But while we were there, often or other women were there, they would experience migraine headaches. They would wake up in the middle of the night, especially in the attic, and they would, I remember one time this woman had, you could see the vein in her forehead pulsing, and she was just like feeling nauseous. She was like, she couldn't hardly stand. She was so sick. And we said, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 in the morning. And a couple of us said, well, let's just go outside and we'll walk down the road a little bit and see if that helps clear everything up and you feel better. And so we did. And when we walked and when we went past the boundary to the Amish farm, her headache started, and like, after about 5 or 10 feet, she was like, oh, I'm feeling a little better, and it was kind of like, okay, it's 2 in the morning. Do we want to go back over there? This woman's like suffering. It was just all these really difficult things to deal with. That happened at my house in Cleveland. Lindsay came to visit, and she was stopping off at my house before she went to the peace camp. I'm going to stay overnight and then go up to the peace camp from there. And she was over at my house for, I don't know, half an hour, and she was starting to feel sick, and she was starting to feel this and that, and then she started having a headache. And actually my friend River, who I was just visiting, she had left town, and she had a different apartment, and she had given me her key and said, if you want to, put Lindsay up in another place, you can always use my place. So anyway, after Lindsay was getting sick, I said, let's just go over to the other place. I'll make you some tea, calm down, and see if that changes anything. And we left, and when we went over there, she got all better again, and she said, I don't want to go back to your house. I don't want to, it was awful. And I wasn't feeling that way, but Lindsay was, and so it was kind of like, okay, so my tolerance is better or different or whatever, but it wasn't like I was immune to it. And so that gave me like the, horrible feeling that I was being zapped a lot. And I had other things happen at my house that were in that kind of vein. And everybody in the zapping committee did. Everybody in their home space or where they were sleeping, where they lived, had those things happening. And in our zapping committee meetings, we would talk about those things. Okay, so I'm kind of skipping around on this health issue, but I have to tell you, since this is coming up in my head right now, I have to tell you this part, and this is the really hard part, that at the beginning, when we started really consolidating our zapping committee crew, you know, and who was really involved, and telling women, if you're not going to be involved, don't come to the meetings. You're just not welcome to the meetings. We have to keep ourselves protected, and this is who we are. You can be in our meeting, but you have to just be serious about it and committed. And people didn't know that off the top, so they usually didn't. But we talked seriously, personal stuff for like the first hour of that meeting, and we would just go around and we'd talk about what was going on with us. We hadn't seen each other for 4 to 6 weeks or something, what things happened in our houses and our spaces, what information, but kind of our personal feelings, not just like the general, this is what I found out scientific wise. It was more like what's going on inside of us. And there was always a lot of stuff going on, but we decided early on in that group that if we started coming down with serious health issues, that we would leave the group. And we would not get to the point where we were debilitated and couldn't take care of ourselves. Because if we did that, the rest of the group would probably band together and try to take care of that person. And that would drain our resources, our energy, and our time. And we didn't live in the same city or anything, so we'd have to kind of really work with that a lot. And that wouldn't take us away from the work of the zapping committee. So we kind of made this understanding among all of us that we would keep the zapping committee priorities first. And then if we had to leave the group, if we came down with serious issues, we would leave the group and just say, we're not working with the group anymore because I can't. My health is getting too bad, and I'm getting rid of the group. But the thing is, when we did that, we would not be able to contact the group anymore. Not on a personal level, peace camp level, or zapping committee level. We would just break all of our ties. Because if we didn't, we would continue to be followed, tapped, and zapped. And if our health was deteriorating because of the zapping, then we needed to be stopped. We needed to take care of our health, and that was getting out of the zapping and getting out of the direct line of fire. And so stopping whoever was watching us, if they were watching us, from watching us because we were no longer affiliated with the peace camp or the group. So once you said bye, it was bye, and it might be for life, and it wasn't going to be for a couple of months and then come back. That was very clear. Once you're out, you're out. And because we're a small group and we were kind of dealing with these kind of big issues and personal issues, it was a tight-knit group. Like, we cared about each other a lot. And we weren't also, you could just replace a person. Everybody had their own areas that were really that they gravitated towards and could do well, but that started happening. People started leaving the group because of health issues, and then we would never see them again because that was the rule. And that was heart-wrenching. It was a heart-wrenching thing. So that happened with me. I started getting sick, and I started realizing that. And that was after Lindsay came to my apartment. And it was at that point I was always back into denying it, like if that was happening or not. There are these weird things that would happen. Like I said, the little men outside my house one day, and all these things. But I was functioning pretty well, but the thing is with me, what was happening was I wasn't able to go through the day without having to take a nap, and I was sluggish a lot, and it was kind of the chronic fatigue syndrome stuff that people were coming down with. And at that time, it was the late 80s, and nobody was even acknowledging chronic fatigue syndrome was a issue that was a health issue. Like, you couldn't get a doctor to diagnose that or anything. I didn't have health insurance. I never went to doctors anyway. But I noticed before I left, and she got very sensitive to fluorescent lighting in stores. She couldn't go into the grocery store after 5 minutes. She couldn't think anymore, and she had to just have a list, go in there, get out. And she had to leave. Her girlfriend came when she was leaving, because her girlfriend had 2 kids, and her girlfriend was like, I don't want to subject my kids to zapping anymore. I'm not into that. And they lived in the country. They were definitely being zapped at their house and stuff. And so her girlfriend came. Has a hard time saying all this. So I came with her today to tell you that she's leaving the group. And she didn't stay for the meeting. And the other thing, we would have to hand over all our files and all our information to the group, so we wouldn't have it. So I got all this stuff, which is lots of files. And that was, I think, for me, one of the hardest days. It was really difficult to cut these ties with people and just not have any notice beforehand that this was going to happen that day. It was just a hard thing for me. So it came my turn, and then it was like, shit, I have to do this. And the peace camp, I'd been involved with the peace camp since 83, really, 84 in a big way, but it was 91. It was 7 years that I'd been involved. And ups and downs, and me, I was like sometimes a fundraiser, and sometimes, I did everything, every job at some point. And so I sold my house. In the next stabbing meeting, I just said goodbye, and I said, I'm not coming back. And when, said goodbye, my little secret ceremonies in the peace camp, I walked around and bye, threw some things onto the land, and left and told everybody, don't call me, I'll call you. The zapping committee definitely would not be calling me. At the time, my dad was really sick, and he was like, not sure, he was one of those sick where he could last a few months or he could die. And but I had to leave Cleveland. I told all my friends in Cleveland, don't call me, don't try to find me, don't come visit me. I'm not going to be, I'll call you when I'm ready to contact you and stuff like that. And they were kind of scratching their heads over that one. They didn't really understand what I was doing, but I couldn't explain it to them. And so I just had to make all these arrangements and kind of make them in secret. Like, some people I would tell certain things to, but mostly people didn't know. There was no one other person that understood exactly what I was doing. They were just like, I don't know, Woody's gotten something in there and she doesn't want to talk to anybody, And so that's where it was. And it was like, cut my life off and go find something else to do. And I didn't know what to do because I just did odd jobs. And I never really had a career other than the engineering thing, and I wasn't going to go back to that. And I had to figure it out. I just had to go into the zapping committee and tell them, goodbye, here's all the files, I'm leaving now. And they were really upset about that. That was another big, like, not you. It's like, yes, I'm moving on, because we had that commitment, everyone in the committee would be accepting of whatever our decisions were. They wouldn't really question that, but it was just a big blow. And, I didn't contact anybody for years and years and years after that. It was just like I disappeared off the face of the earth. And, I couldn't really have anyone's shoulder to cry on because there was nobody that I was going to that would even understand that, And my family didn't know anything about what I was doing, so. But like you, Hershey, I never contacted anybody because it was against the rules, It was many, many years after that, like 98, before I contacted people like Sarah And like I said, that's the emotional part for me because they were so close to me. They were my really strong buddies. You know, doing the peace work that we all are devoted to doing, you know, that was the work of trying to maintain our life and our integrity, and our, even if that meant losing relationships. And I feel like, you know, I know what that struggle is. And it wasn't like climbing over the fence. It was putting that in your everyday life and be willing to do those things. And I don't have any regrets around it, but it was difficult. It was really difficult. It was difficult for everyone in that group. And I don't know if the other people in the zapping group have talked about that, but it was probably the hardest part. It was very hard to run around the country educating people around zapping. It was really hard to talk to scientists and try to figure out what to do with that information and everything. But the hard part was just when it came down to the nitty-gritty. Are you willing to sacrifice your entire life and go live on a farm with people you don't know? You know, so that's why it's emotional. Any more questions?
Two questions. One, if you realized what you were getting into with the zapping, and once you did realize, why you didn't get out sooner?
First of all, no. There was no way that we could ever have known what was going to happen once we started with the zapping stuff. It started as a need that some of us recognized had to happen, and some of us had an interest in addressing that need for different reasons. And some of it was, for me, I did have a technical background, and I felt I could understand things and look at things in a way that a lot of women couldn't because they had liberal arts background or English backgrounds or women's studies or something like that. Different women got into it for different reasons. And as I pointed out, like, we first tried to figure out how to have meetings even, and how not to be monitored and listened to and stuff like that. We started going down this path of figuring it all out and what we had to do and how we had to do it. Along and figuring all that stuff out, then we started getting a little bit more understanding that we as individuals were being monitored, not just the peace camp, but now the government seemed to have an interest in us particularly. Our phones where we lived in Cleveland, it was tapped. And you could say, how do you know that? Well, one time I was having a discussion with somebody on the phone that was in the zapping committee, and so we had our discussion, which of course was all full of coded words because we couldn't talk about it. We just like referred to things like lawnmowers and things like that, which were different things. I hung up, and then I went to call somebody else again, and I was listening to my conversation that I just had. You know, it was like it was being played back into my phone, and I was like, you know, am I crazy? What's going on here? But I know, so it was taped. It was being played back. They just switched it wrong and, you know, got it on my phone. And I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't picked it up. So stuff like that, like I said, stuff like that happened, and certainly I would never want the government to tap my phones and listen to my every conversation and know who was visiting me, etc., like, etc. And there were things that were happening on a psychological level with me, like I would have nightmares sometimes, and I had this kind of fear that I would walk out of my house one time, there'd be government agents to whisk me away, and no one would know where I was going, where I was. The zapping committee, I just wouldn't have shown up for the meeting, you know. No one would know for weeks or months how to track me or where I would have gone. Most of the people in Cleveland didn't know I was involved with the zapping committee, so, you know, they just knew I went to the peace camp every once in a while, like I had for many years. So I had these ideas that were kind of scary, and like I said, at the beginnings of the zapping committee, we talked about things that were going on with us personally, on a personal level, and some of those are the things that we would talk about, like I don't think I'm going crazy, but I think I'm getting more paranoid. And this is my fear, and how can we, as a group, address my fear, because I don't really want to live with this fear, and every day of my life. And then we try to set up some safeties and ways to help each of us in our daily lives in a way that would not continue to call attention to us by the government, but that would help us, kind of weather the storm. So no, I wouldn't have wished that on me, and if I'd known that it was going to happen at the beginning, would I have continued on? That's a hard question to ask, because I've asked the same question of people who are activists and have found themselves, between Israeli troops and Pakistani troops, trying to keep the troops away from some school or something like that, and they're international observers, and I've asked them the same question, and the best answer I've ever received, which I keep in my head, is you don't start in that position. You don't start ever thinking, I'm going to be standing in front of a soldier who's pointing a gun in my chest and meanly telling me to move on. You're never gonna say, oh, let me do that. What happens is you start going down that path, and then you just keep on saying, I have to do the next right thing. I have to do the next right thing. And you end up, you're a person who's not Israeli or Pakistani or Palestinian, and they're having a situation. There's an international witness group being formed. You're there. You're very politically involved in wanting peace for those area. And so you step up to the plate. You say, I can do it, and I will do it. And then the next thing you know, you're in that line of fire, directly in the line of fire. And I think that that's what the answer is. None of us would have said at the very beginning, oh yes, please monitor me, please follow me around, please zap me every day, of my life. None of us would have chosen that. But as you go on, you just do the next right thing. And I think that's true for most of the women that I know from the peace camp, most of the people that I admire in my life. They aren't trying to figure it out at the beginning. As they walk through a situation, the risks that are involved are presented to them. They know half of them, but they don't know the other half, and they rely on their intuition, their integrity, and how strongly they believe in what they're trying to do. And they either can do it or they can't do it. Either they can do it or they have kids at home that they have to be back there next day, and they can't do this action today, and I guess as I've gone through life, I've just realized that most people are just trying to do the next right thing. Some more conscientiously thinking through things than not. Why did I continue doing it? Maybe that answers the second part of that question. Just keep going on till at one point you bow out, and that's it isn't a shame to bow out. It's just that you've reached that's it. You can't do it, and the next right thing is to take care of yourself rather than the world.
Why did you feel like you couldn't let people know what it was that you were going through? People in Cleveland who didn't know you were on the zapping committee, why couldn't they know that much?
That was something that I think the zapping committee talked about extensively in meeting after meeting, because we are all having the same problems around that issue. We were having like a secret life. We were having a spy life. And secrecy and spying and, being inclusive, not being exclusive, those were things that just we weren't really wanting to have any of that in our life, and yet that's what we kept on having in our life. One of the reasons why we didn't talk about it to other people that we were involved with intimately, unless they were like our partner, was because we didn't want to put them in danger. There were a couple of people in Cleveland that I was friends with, that I was hanging around with a lot, that I eventually did say I was involved in this, kind of explain what zapping was and what I was doing a lot of times, and just said, sometimes I'd feel like you should know, because then you'll understand when I do this kind of weird thing or whatever, or don't invite you over to my house, or don't want you to come over to my house, like for sure don't want you to come over to my house. It's because I'm afraid that this is happening at my house and I don't want to expose you to it. And or if, you know, I am being monitored and followed and I'm hanging around a lot with you, maybe you'll get monitored and followed, and then you have a choice whether you want to hang out with me or not. So some people I told so that they wouldn't, if they wanted to not be involved with me, that would be okay, and it would be for reasons of protecting themselves. But other than that, it was like, it was the same at the peace camp. You're constantly being listened to, and the government's trying to figure out what you're doing so they can thwart your plans and everything like that. And the less people know about that stuff, then the better. So it was keeping a lid on it.
So when you would go to conferences or workshops and talk about it, did you feel responsible for exposing people in the audience to possible surveillance or monitoring, or did you feel like it was a personal issue for people in your life?
I never felt like this government followed me around and would zap me at a conference or a workshop. I felt like they were at my house zapping me, but I never really was taking that into consideration. Who would show up at these workshops a lot were people who also felt that they were being exposed to electromagnetic radiation a lot, for different reasons, or that they had been operated on and there was some kind of receiver in their head and they were being instructed to do things. Sometimes these people maybe had schizophrenia things going on, and maybe they were real. We never knew because we sounded just like them. And so a lot of times people who came to the workshops were people who had studied the issue in their own personal lives, are having problems. And again, because we had so much validation from scientists saying that yes, the government does target people and they do things without people's consent in kind of conspiratorial ways, we can say that your group or this person is right for that. This is a perfect person to work that stuff on. So we never knew whether they were making it all up or whether it was absolutely 100% true. We just kind of passed on information to people who were interested in the information. I didn't really have concerns about them being zapped. They were already having their own headaches around that. So,
based on the research you did and what you've experienced, do you have any hypotheses or actual answers about why the U.S. government would, one, zap the camp, zap you personally?
What I can say is that from our research, we know that the military has been researching using electromagnetic radiation as weaponry since the 50s. Since radar, basically. When they learned, World War II is when they developed radar. And all of a sudden they had this way of communicating through the air, invisibly, with electromagnetic radiation, radio waves. And before that, they didn't have radar. The warplanes, you took off and they might come back or they might not, but you didn't really have communication with them. Or you didn't have radar to set up your targets. But all of a sudden this was a very interesting development. And so the government researched this for a long, long time before it ever, in the late 80s, we started feeling the effects of that. The idea was, wouldn't war be so much easier if you could incapacitate people without killing them? If you could win a war without bombing cities and having all this destruction to clean up later on. Let's just, paralyze the population or the leaders of the opposition so that they can't operate, that they can't think straight, that they just throw up all the time. How can you lead when you're throwing up all the time? Or when you have a migraine headache for, 10 days running? If your brain explodes, we can, and there's no proof that anybody did anything, that it just happened. the possibilities are endless. Crowd control. I mean, wouldn't the government look so much better if they didn't have people in those shields and helmets with tear gas things all over their bodies and, you know, truncheons to beat people with? If there are just 3 people out there with a little remote control, a troublemaker, you know, troublemaker, and incapacitate people. So it's a wonderful tool of war, and it's been being researched for a long time. In order to develop these weapons, they do need to figure out how each frequency works, okay? Because just minor changes in frequency, you can have a brain exploding or a brain hallucinating, you know, or a migraine headache. And, you know, you don't want to turn the button up too high or whatever, and you don't, everybody's different and all these things, so it just takes a lot of experimenting with real subjects. Women are more susceptible than men because they have a uterus and a watery base in their abdomen. And so this stuff around electromagnetic radiation problems is everywhere today because of cell towers. In the late 80s, they were just putting up cell towers. And our group was running into that a lot, like, oh, they're going to put a cell tower over here, they're going to put a cell tower over there. We're learning about electromagnetic radiation under electrical towers and what they did to women who are pregnant, babies being deformed and stuff like that. You know, right under the tower, it was fine. 3 houses away, it was terrible. And it was because of the way the electromagnetic waves happened and what frequencies they were and stuff like that. And so we're just learning about all that stuff, and why they would do it at the peace camp. We were a perfect target. We were isolated. We were all women. We were a lot of us childbearing age, things like that. They could and disenfranchised women pretty much. You know, they weren't women that society would look on as leaders. Troublemakers. We were troublemakers, and so it was a great population to work with. The electromagnetic radiation things could affect things like hallucinations, and a lot of times it affected at the peace camp irritability. And with irritability, as a matter of fact, we felt the regional meetings were zapped because then people couldn't agree, come to consensus. That's how the meetings are run. And there'd be a lot of people that were irritated with everybody else. There was a lot of issues that were irritating to deal with, but being zapped for 5 hours while you're trying to deal with them would certainly make it harder to come to decisions, to keep the peace camp running smoothly.
Do you feel like the U.S. military considered the peace encampment a threat or some sort of threat to them?
You know, the U.S. military thinks that they can win a war, for instance. You know, and now we're in Iraq. They thought we won a war after 2 weeks or whatever it was. They announced it and everything. You know, 8 years later, we're at war in Iraq. We can't get out. It's not the technological big bombing that wins the war. It's little people that hide while the big bombs are going on, and they come out and they, you know, keep nibbling away. And so the U.S. military, I don't know what they think, but they always think kind of incorrectly when it comes to war. Or at least anyway in my lifetime. And as a result, they keep misjudging things. And so the peace camp, were we a threat? No, we were probably a little fly in the ointment. You know, fly in the ointment, and we wouldn't go away, we wouldn't go away, we wouldn't go away. They just kept on thinking, this is just a little handful of scraggly women that are know-nothings, you know. They have nothing over there. They have no money and they have no equipment, so they aren't a threat, but they just won't get away. It's kind of like having gum on the bottom of your shoe, you know? It's a very annoying thing, and it keeps you from moving quickly because you're trying to get it off all the time. And you can't until you sit there and really work with it, you know? And so, yeah, I don't know if they consider us a threat or not, but...
Do you feel like, in retrospect, that this zapping contributed to the encampment finally closing or not being an effective place or a safe place for women to be?
It brought together a lot of issues that made it impossible for the camp to continue as it had before. Before it was like, any woman is welcome, please come and live here as much as you can, blah, blah, blah. After zapping, it was kind of like, well, you can live here, but you might have all these health issues. You can live here, but if you're pregnant, you better not, you know. Don't bring your children, don't bring your... It was the zapping decisions that the camp had to make because of zapping were actually, I think, very contributory to the camp not having a good woman base. And that's what it is, a woman-based camp. And so when half the women are being told not to come, that would like to come, then yeah, it would dissolve that camp. I think that it contributed a lot to the problems.
And in your estimation, when did zapping start at Seneca, and when did it taper off?
I think that in 86 or 87, maybe 87 is when the zapping started. At least that's when we became aware of it. I don't know what was going on before then, but I left in 91 and it was still going on then. So I didn't have any contact with the camp, so I don't really know about the ending of it there.
Okay. And why did you get back later? You did contact some of the women in the zapping group, and you did contact some women from Peace Camp. Why did you do that?
I can't remember. It would be great if I could give you a good answer to that, but I know I was going to, like, Sarah lives in Philadelphia, and I was going to visit my brother who lives in Philadelphia, and I knew Sarah lived there, and I think on a whim I called her, and it was really a great phone call because she hadn't heard from me, I hadn't heard from her, and it was just a wonderful, like, oh God, you're alive in the world. And maybe she was the first one I contacted, but after that I contacted, not everybody, I still haven't contacted everybody in the zapping group. But Laura Boswell at that reunion a couple years ago, that was the first time I'd seen her since 91. That's a long time. I had talked to Cindy Sangre, and that was around some history thing I needed to talk to her about. But that was only a few years earlier. But we didn't talk about any of the zapping stuff.
So did you feel like in contacting Sarah or seeing Laura that you were breaching the agreement you all made?
Yes. When I contacted Sarah, it definitely was like, I'm going to do it, but it might not be a good idea, but I'm going to do it. And I did. And then Laura, you know as well as I did at that 2006 reunion, we didn't talk about zapping until the very end. And I was the one that started talking about it. And I kept looking over at Laura, and she was like, just kind of looking at me, wondering how far I was going to go to talk about some of these things. And at one point I did talk to her, and I said, Laura, these things need to be talked about. And Laura agreed, but it was just that we just didn't have the permission. We never had a zapping committee meeting where we said, can we dissolve this? Can we talk? Whatever. We never had that.
Were there any health ramifications that followed you contacting Sarah in 98, I think you said, or Laura in 2006?
No. Like, I didn't feel like I was being zapped or monitored or anything like that. I have to say that I have a hearing problem today, and I think that was directly due to zapping, though it's never been proved or anything like that. But there's some kind of special things about my hearing problem. And I think that Sarah has a lot of health issues, and we all have health issues. We can't prove it was the zapping stuff, but they all seem to be in that category. Different things with everybody, but.
And the name that you guys came up with, how did you decide on that name for your zapping group?
The name, like the zapping committee, that name?
Coral.
Oh, Coral. I forgot about that. Rainbow Light. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah, we talked about that for a lot of time in one of the zapping meetings, because we thought we should have a name, even though we weren't even going to like be public with that name. But I think the Committee for Rainbow Light was named that because it was a spectrum of energy, but we wanted light and we wanted to make it positive, so it was rainbow light rather than, you know, electromagnetic killer rays.
And after you bowed out, did you have any idea about how long the group continued?
No, I don't think it lasted much longer, because the camp stopped working. And so the issue of whether the camp was being zapped kind of went away.
The work that you all set out to do in Coral and in the zapping committee, were you successful? Were you effective?
There are many levels of effectiveness or ineffectiveness, I think. And on a personal note, I can say I continue to believe that every person can make a difference, and they can stand up to injustice in whatever ways they feel are appropriate, and that they can do themselves. And it confirmed that with me. Like, I can stand up to the U.S. military and confront them on this issue of creating weaponry to destroy the world, you know, and I can just do it, and they can like it or not like it, but they can do it. So effectively, it's made me strong. And as far as the military stopping their research and not developing weapons, I don't think they stopped doing any of that stuff, that they continue to figure out how to hurt people and create a situation where they can dominate areas or whatever. I don't think, if you're talking about effectiveness, that zapping committee did that. They might have alerted the military that they better not publicize what they're doing, because there might be other groups like us to confront them, but I don't think that they stopped doing it. So effectiveness, in a way, or, you know, what the Coral group did, I think it was a forerunner for a lot of groups in this country today that are working to address electromagnetic radiation pollution in the cities and in the not just in the as a military weapon, but in everyday lives, that people are having problems. Cell phone towers, radiation, EMR, everywhere. Can't get away from it. Health issues happening because of it. I think there's a lot of groups out there today that are addressing those issues. We were addressing those issues in a different way in the 80s. And, you know, so effective. We were some of the people that started pulling the blanket up to see what was underneath it.
Are you aware of those kinds of weapons that were being experimented and developed back then being used in warfare today? Any reports from Iraq, Afghanistan, where you are aware of these kinds of weapons?
I think there are. I think there are things happening. Even when back in the 80s, I felt that the weapon was being used in certain ways. Aneurysms that people have are a result of a bubble kind of thing happening in a weakened vein and stuff like that. And keep on, back then when we were researching, we were looking at stuff and news stories and stuff, often there would be somebody who would die of an aneurysm on the eve of a congressional hearing, or they would be hospitalized because of an aneurysm, and they were a scientist that had been involved in this group that was kind of a scientist that was starting to blow the whistle, We had several stories like that, and aneurysms are something that are one of the things that are as a sign of that could happen because of zapping. More and more, I have to say, my next door neighbor died of a brain aneurysm very suddenly. She was a young woman, and when I say young, like 30 or 40, and I lived on the 3rd floor, and she lived on the 2nd floor next door. And the street is over here, so if there was a being directed and she was in it, I didn't know my 1st floor neighbor told me that. She was upset because the woman next door had died of a brain aneurysm, had been fine. She used to wait at the bus stop with her, and they had gotten to be friends, and she had just died 2 days before or something, and I didn't know her or anything, but my neighbor happened to tell me that, and I was like, died of a brain aneurysm all of a sudden. And Lindsay coming and getting sick, like my apartment's being zapped, and this person got in the crossfire, that kind of thing. So yeah, I do think that it's being used, but I don't know how, because it's all incidental, anecdotal, and I'm kind of focused on the aneurysm thing. I've noticed that lots more people die of aneurysms these days than they used to. You never used to hear about that, but now you hear about it all the time. One of the things that our zapping committee did was we did try to go to 2020, some show like that, and getting them to look at all of our information and them do their own investigation and a story on it. And they got an interview with the people to try to get this thing going. They were interested in doing it, but in the end they decided not to go with that because first of all, basically it was too controversial. The doors would be closed to them. They couldn't prove anything, and they didn't have the enough stuff to blow the whistle on that, and so they didn't go with that. But in order for that, like Time magazine or Newsweek, to actually print something about that stuff, they'd have to have a big body of evidence behind them proving that that was true, because they wouldn't just do that otherwise. They wouldn't just say it on hearsay or a couple comments. They'd have to have a large body of evidence. So whenever you hear something about that, the newspaper or journalist knows a lot more in order to back himself up. And again, nowadays you hear journalists being called on the rug for reporting and stuff like that. That it's bad, and that some people reveal their sources, and that's all very controversial because those journalists had to get that information and they have to protect their sources, and they're under fire. We felt that way a lot. The government, I think, really has a very vested interest in protecting its information around electromagnetic weaponry, because people will just come out of the woodwork everywhere and saying they're doing this, they're doing that, and it would be very a lot of mayhem.
Can I just ask one more question, and I'll be done, and you guys can go? If you would just tell us why you're decided that this needs to be talked about now, and that you're willing to do this interview, and tell us why.
Thank you for asking me that question. I had had to do a lot of thinking about that. The problem with talking about it is that some people who are involved with the group in the past may start getting harassed again, or may not, but they might not like that they were put in a jeopardy around it. And I think every single person in the committee has taken great pains to separate themselves from that so that they can live their life again and again. I think most of us have some health issues at this point that are a drag, and don't want that to be exaggerated anymore. And so part of talking on camera, on video, which you've told me is you're printing up these things and then putting them on the internet. Well, you know, there it goes, it's all out. That was a big thing I had to deal with in my head to figure out whether that was okay for me to talk about that stuff. The other part is, the other side of that is that you two are doing a good trying to cover the archives, trying to get the peace camp understanding what really happened at the peace camp, the goods, the bads, the ins, the outs, everything. And if we are silent about some of the things that happened, then we don't have an accurate picture, basically. And it irritates me when I hear some things were uncovered 50 years later after the event, and back then if they had been uncovered, people would have acted differently because they knew information. Information is power, and if we don't know what our government is doing, if 100 years from now somebody goes, oh, that's what our government was doing, they were developing electromagnetic radiation, well, that's probably why we were all in these little boxes now. And you know, if we had known about that then, we could have done something, or maybe we would have, or maybe we wouldn't, but we didn't have a choice because we didn't have the information. And we have talked about this, and I'm leaving it up to you to make those decisions. But as far as I'm concerned, if I have the information, then it's important to let other people have the information I have in order to make decisions about their lives. And it's sometimes difficult to find those lines, what's safe and what's not, and what's a good idea and what's a bad idea. But when it comes down to history, today is an important day. Tomorrow is an important day. We need to make decisions about peace and war every day these days, because war is everywhere at this point. Our government is not a good government. Our government is a very oppressive force in the world. If there are things I can do that can change that, then it's in my mind, my responsibility to do that. I'm not acting responsibly, even as a good citizen of the world, if I hold back information that people could look at and evaluate. They can think I'm just kind of a nutcase, or they can take my word seriously and move on from there or something. But in general, speaking out about the zapping committee at this point, it's a lot of things. For me, part of it is it's a letting go of that responsibility and those commitments I had to the other people in the group. It's about moving on, and it's also about having an accurate portrayal of the peace camp. And there are a lot of things at the peace camp that weren't good, and a lot of things that caused problems. And the zapping committee is one of those areas that was just, there's only a handful of people that were in the zapping committee, and their views are probably very different from people who weren't involved in that committee. And I'm one of those people, so